Hi, it's me JD and welcome back to my channel. If you're an experienced watercolor artist with years of experience and training and education, what are you doing here? Just kidding, everyone's welcome. Today's video will feature watercolor hacks for beginners. I myself am a crafter, not necessarily an artist. I don't know if there's a difference, but we're just gonna go with it. Today's first hack is a cheaper alternative to hardboard panel. I got this off of Amazon and it was a third of the price. It's actually a regular clipboard. So if you're on a budget, definitely check out just using a clipboard as opposed to getting a watercolor hardboard panel. Here's a tip for creating smoother watercolor washes. Try not to let your paint dry until you are completely satisfied with the consistency and smooth finish of your painting. You can try tipping your board up a little to get that paint moving a little quicker. Otherwise, just keep adding water until it's the finish that you want it to be. The next hack prevents tearing of your watercolor paper. Now, when most people watercolor, they use painter's tape to hold down their paper because it's usually pretty effective, but sometimes, as you can see, it tears. So what I recommend doing is before you even put painter's tape on your project is to put it on your hands first, like run it through your skin, your clothes, just so you take some of the tackiness off. The next hack is a way to erase your mistakes. Believe it or not, you can actually erase some watercolor mistakes to an extent, I should say. So what I'm using is one of those magic erasers you use to clean, your household surfaces and counters. And what you do is just dip it in a little bit of water and it should rub off your mistake really easily. The next hack is how to speed up drying time. Now you've painted your project and now you're waiting for dry, but let's say you're a little impatient like me. So what you can do is you can get one of these tools, which is a heat tool. Or it's called a heat gun as well. I use it for heat embossing, but you can also use it to dry your project so you can move on to the next step of painting. Definitely don't use it too much, otherwise it actually might warp your paper or might even harm it in some way. If you're a watercolor beginner and novice like me, you might have some struggles when you want to maintain the same colors and consistency using regular watercolors. Or perhaps watercolor brushes are intimidating or you just don't know how to use them yet. You can turn to watercolor markers. Watercolor markers come in different shapes and colors, and what's great is that the color is already there. You don't have to think too hard about what color you want to use. You don't have to worry about mixing the colors or having your watercolors go to waste after your project is finished. I mean, watercolor markers are pretty user-friendly. If I could use them, anyone can use them, you know what I mean? I'm using two of my favorite watercolor marker brands. One has a thin tip and the other has a thicker tip. You can use your watercolor marker to draw and color and then use a water brush to help blend that color out. So that means there's an array of colors to use with your watercolor markers, not just the color that's on the marker. This is especially great for watercolor beginners who are just learning to blend colors. If you have the thicker watercolor marker tip, you can even do some hand lettering with them. I store my watercolor markers horizontally so they don't dry out. I have an example here of how I use stamps with watercolor markers. Now, if you're like me and you're not the best freehand drawer, you can use stamps and create a watercolor look with watercolor markers. What you do is you stamp your image in really light ink, then use your markers, and then go over it with a water brush to help blend out the colors, and it really gives a fantastic result. And you can really trick people into thinking you're good at watercolor. The next hack gives you a really organic look to your watercolor project. And all you need to start is a Ziploc bag or some plastic. What you're going to do is you're going to cut it into strips, and then you can pull out your regular watercolors or use watercolor markers. But the steps is to scribble your watercolor on, then spritz it with like a water mister or a spray bottle, and then smoosh it onto your watercolor paper. And it creates this really fantastic splash of abstract color. You can even do this with Tombow markers because they are water-based. So you scribble, you spritz, and then you smoosh. Heck, you can even use this with your regular Crayola markers. This would be a great project for the kids, and it doesn't damage the marker at all from what I've seen. If you have liquid watercolors, you can just drop the colors onto the piece of plastic and then smoosh it on as well. The next hack uses watercolor and stamps. So if you have a huge stamp collection, like me, here's another way to use them. You can color on the stamp itself. I'm using Tombow markers to color my stamp. And then once you have your image colored, you're going to spritz it with water and then stamp it onto your project. I find that using a stamp positioner like the Misty is a great tool for doing this technique. Once your image is stamped, you can just clean up your stamp and then move on to the next step. And so I'm going to do this process for you again. You color your stamp and then you spritz it with water and then you stamp it onto your paper and then you just clean up your stamp. This technique also works really well with layering stamps if you have them. I recommend using this with like 2 to 3 step layering stamps. If you get into 4 or 5, it might get a little complicated, but it actually looks great. As you can see here, it looks realistic, and it's another great way to trick people into thinking you're actually good at watercolor. The next hack, which really isn't a hack, it's more of a technique. It's heat embossing resist with watercolor. So what you do is you ink up your stamp with some Versamark ink. It's a sticky ink. And then you stamp the image on your paper. Make sure that you get good coverage on it. And then you pour some embossing powder over top, and the powder will stick to whatever areas that you have inked. Now, I forgot to run my anti-static tool over this project before I inked, because if I did, I wouldn't have stray pieces of embossing powder everywhere. So I just use a brush to brush away those extra pieces. Then I use my heat tool to melt the embossing powder. Then I will tape my project down, using another hack, as you can see there. And then I will paint over the top of my project using regular watercolor paints. And what the heat embossing does is that it resists my watercoloring painting, so the stamped image comes through. You can do watercolor resist with masking fluid, crayons. I just use embossing powder here because I have a ton of it. All right, the last hack is to help flatten your project once your project is dry. As you can see here, even with the tape, my project is pretty warped. Now you can lay some heavy books over top and let it, help it flatten overnight. Or if you're impatient like me, you can run it through your manual die cutting machine, probably twice, I would say, and that'll help flatten it out. Well, the first try didn't really do anything, so I'm going to run it through again the other way with it facing down and see if that helps, and run it through twice, and then you can see that it definitely helped flatten your project out. That does it for this video. Let me know down in the comments which of these watercolor hacks was your favorite, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on my next video. Thanks!